December 24th, 1978. A sleepy winter afternoon in Shakhty is about to shatter into horror. By the banks of the Grushevka River, a man noticed a peculiar shape drifting along the icy waters. As he approached, he froze in shock. A small, pale body floated lifelessly. Overcome by panic, he sprinted to the nearest police station, shouting about his gruesome find. Authorities arrived swiftly, retrieving the body of a young girl. Her hands were stiff, her face bruised, and a scarf tightly knotted around her neck. But it wasn't just strangulation. The medical examination revealed unspeakable horrors, multiple stab wounds and signs of assault. This was no accident. This was murder. She was only 9, a child of simple joys and small dreams. The victim was identified as Elena Zakotnova, a cheerful 9-year-old who lived just blocks from the crime scene. That morning she had left home for school, her parents reminding her to be cautious. But when the evening came, Elena never returned. Her parents searched the neighborhood frantically, their hearts heavy with dread. 2 days later, their worst fears materialized. As they identified her lifeless body at the morgue, her mother collapsed in anguish, clutching the scarf, Elena's scarf that had become her noose. The town mourned with them, unaware that this tragedy was just the beginning of a darker tale. The police scramble for leads, but evil lurks too close for comfort. Investigators canvassed the area, speaking with anyone who might have seen Elena that fateful day. A neighbor mentioned a tall man with glasses loitering near the bus stop where Elena was last seen. Another neighbor recalled a faint light in the house of Andrei Chikatilo, a reclusive man who rarely visited his property. Chikatilo was brought in for questioning, his demeanor calm yet unsettling. "I don't know this girl," he stated plainly, his words devoid of empathy. His alibi, cleaning his vacant house, seemed plausible, and without solid evidence, the police released him. For now, the real killer walked free, blending back into the shadows. Years pass, but the killer's thirst for blood only grows stronger. From 1981 to 1984, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Victims were discovered in forests, train stations, and remote areas, all mutilated in similar ways. Most were women or children, their bodies bearing the hallmarks of a depraved mind: stab wounds, missing body parts, and signs of assault. Fear consumed Rostov, and whispers of a serial killer began to circulate. Despite mounting evidence, the police struggled to identify the perpetrator. Chikatilo, meanwhile, continued his reign of terror, confident in his ability to outsmart law enforcement. The streets of Rostov grew quieter, fear replacing the usual bustle. By 1984, parents no longer allowed their children to roam freely. Women walked in groups, their eyes darting nervously as night fell. Each new body that was discovered brought the city closer to hysteria. The killer's signature, stab wounds, sexual assault, and disfigured eyes became a grim calling card. Despite police efforts, the trail always went cold. Meanwhile, the killer thrived on the terror he had sown, feeding his growing appetite for control and domination. In 1984, a suspicious man carrying a knife and rope was arrested. During a routine patrol near a bus station, police noticed a tall, thin man acting strangely. Andrei Chikatilo, 48, was carrying a briefcase containing a knife, rope, and Vaseline, items that raised immediate suspicion. He explained calmly that they were for work, but his demeanor was unsettlingly detached. Chikatilo's background painted a portrait of a deeply troubled individual. Born in 1936 to a poor Ukrainian farming family, he grew up amidst famine and hardship. His childhood was marred by stories of cannibalism during the Holodomor and his mother's strict, often abusive parenting. At school, his frail build and awkward demeanor made him an easy target for bullies. Worse still, he suffered from a sexual dysfunction that led to deep-seated insecurities and an eventual psychological spiral. These early experiences shaped a man desperate for control and validation, driving him to commit unimaginable acts later in life. Though his arrest seemed like a breakthrough, a critical mistake shattered police hopes. Blood tests failed to link Chikatilo to crime scenes due to a rare discrepancy between his blood and seminal fluid types. Without conclusive evidence, he was released. The monster, once within reach, was free to kill again. After his close call, Chikatilo became more cautious, but also deadlier. Following his 1984 release, Andrei Chikatilo temporarily ceased his murders, wary of heightened police attention. But his compulsion to kill was too strong to resist. Adapting his methods, he targeted victims from towns he rarely visited, luring them to isolated areas. His approach was calculated yet deceptively simple. He offered candy, toys, or small favors to children and engaged women with feigned kindness. Once their guard was down, he struck with unparalleled brutality. Chikatilo's victims bore horrific injuries. They were strangled, stabbed repeatedly, and sometimes mutilated. In some cases, he consumed parts of their bodies, a twisted act that symbolized his dominance over them. To him, these acts were not merely violence, they were rituals. The more depraved his actions became, the greater his sense of control. Chikatilo collected body parts as trophies, extending the satisfaction of his crimes into his private world. His cunning evolution made him more dangerous than ever, as police struggled to anticipate his next move. 1990. After years of terror, a new investigative strategy emerged. By now, Chikatilo's victims numbered in the dozens. Law enforcement enlisted the help of a criminal profiler who painted a chilling portrait of the killer. A middle-aged man, outwardly normal, capable of blending seamlessly into society. Undercover officers flooded train stations, bus stops, and parks, places where the killer was likely to strike. They studied his behavior, waiting for him to slip. The net was tightening, but Chikatilo remained a step ahead. A moment of carelessness sealed Chikatilo's fate. In November 1990, an officer spotted Chikatilo wandering near a train station, attempting to engage in conversation with a young boy. The officer's instincts kicked in. This man matched the description of the elusive killer. Chikatilo was followed and eventually apprehended. This time, police found evidence they couldn't ignore. His bag contained knives, rope, and blood-stained clothing. The walls were closing in on the Rostov butcher. Faced with mounting evidence, Chikatilo remained disturbingly calm. During his initial questioning, Andrei Chikatilo denied everything. His voice was steady, his demeanor unnervingly composed. Investigators knew they were dealing with a manipulative mind. For days, Chikatilo resisted, giving vague answers and feigning ignorance. But the evidence was damning. His movements matched the times and locations of multiple murders, and his behavior at bus stations was suspiciously consistent. The police brought in psychological profilers who played on his need for attention and control. Slowly, cracks began to show. A breakthrough. Chikatilo finally broke under the pressure. After days of silence, Chikatilo requested to speak with investigators privately. "I want to tell you everything," he began, tears rolling down his face. But these weren't tears of remorse. They were of release. For hours, he described his crimes in chilling detail. How he selected his victims, the violent acts he committed, and the twisted satisfaction it brought him. "It's like a fire inside me," he said, emotionless, as investigators listened in horror. His confession included details only the killer could know, solidifying his guilt. The horror deepened as Chikatilo confessed to more murders than expected. Initially, police linked Chikatilo to 21 murders, but his confession revealed 56. Many of the bodies had not yet been found, scattered across remote regions. Each recounting painted a picture of a man driven by uncontrollable urges, incapable of remorse. For Chikatilo, killing was not just a compulsion, it was a ritual. "I took pieces of them with me," he admitted, describing how he mutilated victims to relive his crimes in private. In 1992, the trial of Andrei Chikatilo began, shocking the world. The courtroom in Rostov was packed with journalists, survivors' families, and curious onlookers. Chikatilo, unshackled and defiant, entered with a smirk. During the trial, he often disrupted proceedings, shouting obscenities and displaying erratic behavior. At one point, he stripped naked, claiming to be pregnant. These outbursts, however, were calculated attempts to plead insanity. The judge, unshaken, allowed testimonies from forensic experts and survivors' families. They described the unimaginable horrors Chikatilo inflicted, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. On October 15, 1992, Chikatilo heard his fate. After months of grueling testimony, the judge declared Andrei Chikatilo guilty of 43 murders. The sentence, death by firing squad. Chikatilo showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered for justice. But for the families of the victims, the scars remained. "We'll never forget what he took from us," one mother said, clutching a photograph of her son. February 14th, 1994. The Valentine's Day execution that ended a monster's life. In a small, sterile chamber within Novocherkassk prison, Andrei Chikatilo faced his final moments. Dressed in plain clothes, he sat in silence, his expression unreadable. The guards led him to a stark execution room where the sentence would be carried out. There was no dramatic last statement, no plea for mercy. The executioner raised his rifle, and a single gunshot shattered the silence. Chikatilo slumped forward, lifeless. The man who had terrorized Russia for over a decade was gone. For many, it marked the end of an era of fear, but the wounds he inflicted on his victims' families would never truly heal. Justice was served, but closure was elusive. For the families of Chikatilo's victims, the execution brought little solace. Many had lost young children, siblings or spouses to his monstrous acts. In interviews, survivors spoke of their lingering pain. "No sentence could bring my daughter back," said one father, clutching her photograph. Psychologists noted how the family struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering if they could have done something to prevent the tragedy. The shadow of Chikatilo lingered long after his death, a reminder of the deep scars he had carved into their lives. The case of Andrei Chikatilo reshaped Russia's approach to crime. Chikatilo's reign of terror revealed glaring flaws in Soviet-era law enforcement. From the mishandling of early investigation to the wrongful conviction and execution of Alexander Kravchenko, the case highlighted the need for modern forensic science and procedural reforms. In the years following his arrest, Russia made strides in adopting DNA testing and psychological profiling. Chikatilo's crimes also sparked broader discussions about mental health and the social conditions that breed monsters like him. His legacy was one of horror, but also of hard lessons learned. The story of Andrei Chikatilo remains etched in Russia's collective memory. To this day, the name Rostov Butcher evokes chills. His crimes are studied in criminology classes and discussed in psychological forums as an example of unchecked evil. Residents of Rostov still recall the fear that gripped their city during his killing spree. For survivors and investigators, the memories remain vivid. "We caught him," one detective said, "but the scars he left behind are permanent." Chikatilo's tale is a stark reminder that monsters often wear human faces, hiding in plain sight until it's too late.